we can see this. Great.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Will. Thank you, everyone. I am so happy to be here with you all today. Okay, let's see. Maybe my computer's not happy, but I am. I began all of my work with a positionality statement because marking our positionality when we take up a place of power is direct action we can engage in, which cements equity in our world. So even after that incredible and thorough introduction, I will also say hello. I am Dr. Kelly Elizabeth Wright. I am a Black, biracial, cisgendered woman from Appalachia, and I identify as a member of the queer community. I am currently a postdoctoral research fellow in language sciences at Virginia Tech. I am working class, and while I am not first gen in the sense that most traditionally use the term, I am one generation removed from educational segregation. To begin, these slides are available at this bit.ly link here. Oh, there's not a link here. Just kidding. I'll send them to you afterwards so you can have a full transcript of what I'll say today. I'll be speaking for about 45 minutes, and I'll set the stage for our conversation about linguistic justice by outlining some perceptual basics in the ways we study them. I'll then share my motivations for engaging with some of the computational methods I'm most familiar with, including a brief under the hood how-to of corpus building. Revelations from these approaches manifest in my current research into the metalinguistic awareness of language users and the ways mixed methods can work to represent language users and not merely their usage across practices. So let's begin by discussing perception. Our senses give us the ability to perceive. So smell, touch, taste, hear, and see, and our brains partition that information into discrete, meaningful elements. We're able to determine if something is dark or light, near or far, or if we are hearing a da or a ta. This information is processed in real time. It's categorized in our minds based on all of our collective previous experience of the world. But those are just the basic things we sense that we can be aware of. And language is anything but basic. You cannot make language without a body. Language issues from living sources. Even modalities which may be long removed from the human who created them presuppose another human's presence when we interact with them. Other things we interact with, smells, for example, can radiate from the environment. It could be a tree or even the air itself producing a recognizable pattern when perceived, but those patterns are not inherently social ones. Linguistic perception is inherently social because linguistic production is inherently embodied. We experience language, we always know there's a body involved, our own or someone else's, and our bodies place us at the center of our own stories about what we are perceiving. And the meaning-making process then in our minds is designed to be a relativistic and thus egocentric one. This is one reason Miles Hercules et al. Argue in their typological work that we see deictic expressions like the left coast, next door, or down the road a piece, taking across the world's languages, taking up egocentric points of reference. In the center of our own stories, then, we come to adapt to the patterns around us most often, which are our own language use, the language of our parents, our immediate communities, etc. Focusing primarily on the perception of voices, embodied positionality is taken into account when we hear someone else because we have knowledge about the ways certain bodies are expected to behave. Why do we have that knowledge? Well, we're right here in the present, about to use some language. We aren't stationed in the depth of time, trying to make our first attempts at describing life ever. The social history of the world has occurred. Time's arrow flies forward and will continue flying forward, dragging us all along with it. When we externalize thought, we're doing a little bit more than vibrating a sack of meat, it turns out. When language emerges from any given body, its meaning will always be interpreted in context relative to the individual user. What this tells us is that no two individuals can create meaning in the same way in any modality. And by extending this reality to its furthest application, there is therefore no so-called right way to use language. This is something that is simply not definable due to the nature of embodied communication. Thus, meaning can be understood more as a product of conventionality than universal truth. Perhaps we can take time to marvel at the literal physics of how you have even accomplished communication once in the face of that revelation another day. How we are even doing it right now in different time zones with different sets of vowels in our heads. The phenomena of languaging continuously, smoothly, without much effort, and with most of the individuals you encounter should awe you, but I digress. What we are considering, how the realities of embodied communication tell us that arbitrary or standardized linguistic targets are unnatural, has been in a perfect world. Essentially, we've set up this equation for meaning, but we haven't yet hit play. We haven't fed any data into that system. In theory, the system should operate equitably for all users, whether it defines a target of production itself or not. But as we know, that is decidedly not the case. We know that there are instances in which context, audience, and linguistic material can be held constant, but a difference in embodiment can significantly condition outcomes intentionally or unintentionally for a language user. When we hit play and the social history of the world unfolds over generations of human communicative development, a preference for certain ways of languaging comes to be baked into the ways in which our bodies are capable of externalizing thought. This is what linguistic oppression comes down to at its core. Across time and across communities, the ways in which most people have had open to them to use language in the world has not been entirely free. There is no moral judgment in that statement, merely an observation of environmental constraints. These patterns of oppression are incredibly old. They are older than every living human being. They are older than the printing press. And these engines, which turn what Silverstein referred to as the irreducible dialectic of linguistic production and perception, are one force which has been shaping language variation and change since the beginning. When we start to consider what types of language people deem to be proper, or believe sound pleasing to the ear, or have determined to be more appropriate than other types of language for certain venues or forms of address, none of that falls out of the natural evolution of linguistic systems. Those realities are products of who has been in social control over time. And who has been in social control globally for most of written history have been able-bodied, cisgendered, Christian, white, and moneyed men. It is their relativistic and egocentric perspectives which frame our stories, which set the value for the exchange rate for the linguistic material in all of our linguistic markets. Now, the best definition I have for language is the materialization of thought. Whether we are speaking, writing, or signing, language is an embodied product. It issues from the bodies of individuals, which places certain physical, and by this I am referencing capital P physical, restrictions on its manifestation, right? Like there are some sounds we just can't make, very difficult to produce ingressive and egressive airflow simultaneously. Bodies also have inextricable social histories. Our color, our gender, our size, our ability, our age, all shape the ways in which we can and do produce language, no matter where or when we are. We do, in the moment, have agency to choose a form from our repertoire. Variation and creativity are real, and so is the discursive actualization of self, but the linguistic forms we produce do not manifest without history. They are material and come into being issuing from bodies that already have meaning in history, in contexts that have meaning in history, in places that have meaning in history, in the unfolding and unstoppable arcing gyre of space-time. Considering this, confronting language as an object becomes the special challenge of linguistic inquiry, to hold language still enough to look at it, to understand all of these material consequences of linguistic production. This challenge has been omnipresent in our discipline because we must reckon with the continual mediation of embodied linguistic production and perception through past and present human social history, which contributes directly to its irreducible nature. Early linguistic theorists addressed this challenge by producing to analyze linguistic structure alone, by severing produced linguistic material not only from its path through time, but also from its material history as well. This was necessary, but it's also akin to analyzing and describing a two-dimensional representation of language. Like when you go to the doctor's office and there's a poster slapped up on the wall of the skin or the heart with all of its internal workings exposed and labeled. Those systems are not color-coded inside the body, nor do they manifest in nature in uniform size and shape. We accept what's on this poster as a useful abstraction. In a similar way, we do not have syntax trees in our brains, or maybe we do. Some neurolinguists may disagree. Syntax trees are a useful abstraction. It just happens to be what's being abstracted away from. In the case of the heart and the case of language use are significantly different in terms of the ways in which removal of extant variation and its effects may shape the underlying theory as a result. Not feeding information about a patient's verbal mastery of the dozens, or their use of grammaticalized done, or their current gender expression into theoretical models for cardiac muscle structure likely wouldn't have long-term implications for how this two-dimensional representation is employed in the field in real time or over time. But we know that leaving such things out of our theoretical models of linguistic structure has had some stark implications. As we move forward, I'm going to describe to you some methods which can be employed to demonstrate how social role and embodiment always influence the ways in which minoritized users can and do experience language. But I want to make it clear that linguistic oppression impacts us all, and that no one group is specifically at fault for what I am describing. The examples I present are merely where we can see these forces at work, because in other centralized and less obviously marginalized communities, their effects are more insidious, private, and often subconscious. The big picture to frame the information I am sharing today within is that of human cognition generally and linguistic production and perception specifically. Okay, so let's talk about corpus linguistics. In Dr. Mark Richard Lauersdorf's corpus class, I learned how a body of text can come to stand in for a body of peoples. I also learned that one does not need to rely on extant resources to do one's work, but can instead create a resource for oneself with the right tools and enough time. That the creation of a resource is work, that bringing together similar linguistic data into one place has value of its own. In teaching me how to go get myself data, which is liberatory in the extreme in the age of disinformation, okay? Like, give me another hour and let me talk to you about how incredibly valuable this is. To be able to take information down for yourself and analyze it, that means so much, even outside of linguistics, okay? Mark also taught me to value documentation. He taught me about the ways in which being thorough necessitates being accessible and representative as well. He taught me that biased data sets can sometimes be set to rights just by gathering more data. In our linguistic incubator for collaborative digital research, I developed the means of communicating the idea that historical linguistic data can be used to address active social problems, that patterns which emerge in a corpus reflect patterns emerging in society. And that is how the Serena Williams opprobrious language experiment, or SWOLE, was born. This experiment included a corpus, which began as an in-class assignment and grew into my MA thesis. It contains sports journalism spanning Williams's career from 2007 to 2016, and I built it initially to research covert racism, manifesting as racialized language in the media and its effects on language users. Sports journalism was well suited to this research because it presents a very controlled linguistic frame through which we may view variation patterns manifesting in actual disparities baked into the data, making racialization itself isolable. Racialized media is terminology that is somewhat more common now. Some of you may have even seen it mentioned in the Meghan and Harry specials making the rounds, but in 2015, this concept was one that needed to be proven, defended, and re-exemplified time and again, and that was by the scientists working on it. Lexical racialization looks like terms that are focused on the body, its physical prowess and skill, and/or uncharacteristically intense words. The latter is incredibly common with Serena Williams, whose traditionally segregated world of tennis must recognize her presence in a way that does not reflect the obvious exceptionality of her color. And so from very, very early on in her career, we see her described as superhuman and the GOAT, among other things. After the initial stage of this work was completed in 2017, Serena had a series of public outbursts and endured the ensuing and heavily racialized media frenzy that followed. In response, I took the corpus and expanded it, giving it power to make claims beyond baseline observations of one athlete. And SWOL became the RCC, or the Racialized Semantics and Athletics Corpus, which contains sports journalism covering 120 athletes for a century and is balanced for race and gender. The corpus contains 15,572 lexemes, or lexical types, and totals 8.5 million words, or lexical tokens. And I'm going to take a little extra time than I normally do to give you some information about how I built it. These texts were collected entirely online because I was a baby programmer and basically still am, unless we all cry when we have to do some Python. Okay, my methods involved adding a Google plugin, a search engine results page or SERP extraction tool, which allows all URLs from the results of a Google search to display on a single web page, which it then extracts a list of addresses from. So what am I searching for? Well, I performed a Google advanced search using the name of the athlete with several additional constraints for language of publication and country of origin applied to reduce noise in the returns. Ostensibly, this is gathering the top layer of the internet as it relates to an individual. The SERPed URLs are then copied into a bare text document for each athlete. And once all are gathered, a bash script or a GUI like Bootcat brings down all of the text from each website in turn and stores that text as an individual file. The advantage of using the bash script is it allows you more control when introducing organizational and cleaning steps. For example, skipping over websites like Wikipedia, which wouldn't be considered an article in a journalistic sense. I then used a tool called Bag of Words to give me raw lexical token counts to prepare the corpus I'd pulled together for the analysis I'm about to describe to you. But I would be remiss if I didn't also highlight that depending on your research question and future intentions for the corpus you're building, you might apply any number of additional tools at this stage to create further axes of analysis in your data set. Once the data was organized through the methods I just described, I developed a machine learning algorithm or support vector machine to aid in the objective classification of these data. Simply put, the goal here is a revelation of the informational content in this large body of text. The SVM is not designed to be an automatic racism detector. Its task is to use raw lexical token counts to separate the corpus into two meaningful groups. And remember that this corpus is balanced for race and gender, but surprise, the meaningful groups are organized by race. Now, normally we would expect the difference between Aaliyah Atkinson in the Black subcorpus and Hope Solo in the white subcorpus to be more like 49 versus 51%, and for members in each category to gradually decrease or increase from there. But instead, we see this stark divide with no gradients, and that's a surprising result. So much so that I reran these analyses several times and had field experts, Will Styler, check the outcome for errors, but no. The algorithm was sure, like super sure. So how did the SVM arrive at this output? The random forest model allows us to understand which words were most useful in the SVM's racial categorization task. And scanning down this column here, we find that these are perhaps not the words we were expecting. A word like athletic, for example, is predicted to be distributed equally because each athlete being described in this corpus is world-class. However, we see that there is an imbalance with more occurrences appearing in the Black subcorpus. Presenting this data visually, I'll start by describing the zero on this graph. Maybe. Okay. The zero does not represent that a word has no occurrences, but that it occurred at the same frequency in both subcorpora. The red lines moving down from the zero represent imbalances in the white subcorpus, and the blue lines moving up from the zero represent imbalances in the black subcorpus. So we see that athletic is not distributed equally, but we already knew that, but apparently tactics is. Imbalances like these can have serious implications for the ways in which a language model functions, which Caliscan et al.'s vector model recreation of implicit association tasks demonstrated. In analyzing their outcomes, the authors state that, quote, all implicit human biases are reflected in the statistical properties of language, end quote, and ground this fact in the very origins of prejudice itself. They caution anyone training a machine on large bodies of text to be on the watch for the transmission of prejudice. Okay, but does imbalance in a language model actually mean anything? Like, do these extra occurrences of athletic shape an athlete's career trajectory or our experience of gameplay? Perhaps. So during the 2018 World Cup, Zito Madou pointed out that commentators were using racialized language to describe the match depicted here on the left between Poland and Senegal. These comments were focused on the Senegalese players' athleticism, and a Canadian researcher, Sam Gregory, decided to run with that to see if the two-dimensional renderings you see on the right, which data analytics companies use for various purposes, could be applied as a test bed for measuring racial attitudes. Gregory and colleagues played a 2-minute clip of either the broadcast on the left or the animation on the right to participants and asked them which players seemed more athletic. And they find that for the participants who viewed the broadcast, 70% reported that the all-Black Senegalese players were more athletic. For the participants who viewed a rendering of the broadcast, 62% reported that the all-white Polish players were more athletic. It's difficult to compare those percentages directly, so I've included their reported p-value here to show you that this is a highly significant outcome. Mueller reported these findings stating, quote, the physical advantages that supposedly defined the African team's style of play disappeared as soon as their skin color did, end quote. So this example, I hope, puts imbalances in athletic in my corpus in some more context, but I'm going to share just one more example before we move on. And that is from the German news coverage of the Moroccan team's historic placement in the 2022 World Cup quarterfinals. Here we see a Moroccan player, Sabiri, wearing his national flag and pointing upwards after his team advanced, a gesture which was very quickly equated to a symbolic sign of allegiance with the Islamic State, not the "we're number one" gesture of foam finger fame. This coverage demonstrates that real-world effects of ratiolinguistic ideologies are unconstrained by the modality of linguistic production. Flores and Rosa's 2015 concept of ratiolinguistic ideologies tells us that there is an association between certain bodies and linguistic deficiency that exists no matter how these individuals are producing language. Because bodies cannot be separated from the production of language or their place in society, people who exist in certain types of bodies never produce language in any form that is perceived as proper or standard or respectful or complete or complex or clean or clear or civil or good enough. These ideologies link up with the expectations of those interacting with minoritized people, expectations which stem from the embodied nature of linguistic production and perception and create downstream consequences in institutions outside of athletics. And these consequences can have rather stark implications for the ways in which language-based technologies are applied. In fact, many modern technologies have been shown to have significant biases, which, in my opinion, need amount to little more than an imbalance in the data set to become a palpable ethical issue. Imbalance can look like many things, but in large language models, pulling training data from only the last century, or users of languages of wider communication like Mandarin or German, places an indelible stamp on the future function of that model. Research on bias and fairness in machine learning and artificial intelligence has grown exponentially in recent years. The papers cited here have shown that decision-making algorithms have significant negative biases in areas like criminal sentencing, autonomous vehicles, hate speech, censorship, and language detection, search engines, and facial recognition technologies. Such findings in these papers document the likely experience of many groups of non-standard speakers facing biased automatic speech recognition systems. Yet corporations like Microsoft, Tesla, and Taser, and the US judiciary are actively pursuing ways to incorporate these imperfect, far from equitable systems into our everyday lives. It is difficult to overstate the injustices many will be facing as this happens, and we are the experts poised to intervene by conducting ever more refined research that is attentive to the needs of all. We've considered a lot in a brief time: how our bodies condition the linguistic experience, how bodies of text can represent that experience and one way to build them, and some real-world effects of data set imbalance. And while I could go on speaking about how these effects play out in every institution there is, I'd like to turn now to discussing instead one way I've sought to combat them. Linguistic justice is not a new concept. In fact, the modern version stems from statements that were codified during the Conference on College Composition and Communication in 1974 as the students' right to their own language statement that some of you may have even seen printed on syllabi past. In Baker Bell's foundational text, linguistic justice operates with several core points of action. First, that teaching or expecting only proper or standard English usage reinforces white power structures and systems. Second, a commitment to consistently challenge the myth that there is ever a right way for a given individual to be languaging in any situation, regardless of context. And third, natural variation in linguistic usage that occurs between individuals should be celebrated and not corrected. And people in positions of power must work to create spaces which encourage language use that is entirely free. Baker Bell in this foundational text lays out a narrative of the ways in which Black language users become ghettoized in their own bodies through the education system in a society which thrives on the production of white standardized spoken English. Many generations of Black professionals have been encouraged implicitly and explicitly, both from within and from without their communities, to use more proper language, and not only around authority figures. We do this to be taken seriously, to advance, to keep ourselves safe. Baker Bell reminds Black people of the operation of sociolinguistic ideologies, that our production can never be standard enough to keep us safe because we live in these bodies in this time. We have to do self in this society, and that holding back the language that feels authentic to us, especially when being true to ourselves feels essential, will not save us. I have made one good faith attempt in recognition of all that we've discussed today at taking a fuller picture of all the material factors at play when one is speaking, writing, or signing. Taking this full accounting approach, adopting a universal analytic view, is a challenge because we, like physicists, can never actually view the system we are studying in its entirety. We're inside it. Language is too large for us to see. Read your Newton, okay? Look at how he reckons with planetary oscillation by comparing it to linguistic systems. It's a real treat. We can never set ourselves outside of this system such that we can stand back, look at it, hold it still, and describe it. That's probably why the founders of our field haven't done that. But we can look at facets of language in their entirety. We do this when we interview an individual or embed ourselves in a community or query a body of text. Write 2022 introduces a new method of sociolinguistic interview and departs from a place of radical acceptance of a language user's expertise by prioritizing their knowledge about their own bodies, minds, contexts, and environments. The goal is not to elicit linguistic production for experimentation or phonetic analysis. The goal is to communicate with human beings about how they conceptualize their language use. The goal is centering them in the study of their own variation. This data was then carefully analyzed to reveal patterns in these observations across individuals who do not share bodies or home environments, and establish which linguistic variables may be doing heavy perceptual lifting in the shared specific context that the population writ large exists in, like their workplace. Then focused, incremental, and direct experimentation is conducted with large representative populations in the most accessible yet controlled conditions possible on the perception of specific linguistic material. That material being these potentially heavy lifting variables which have been identified by the population. The approach is necessarily interdisciplinary, and it must be so for the analysis of linguistic objects as they exist in reality, which is in the middle of things. Now, metalinguistic awareness has been considered in the Western canon since Aristotle, but the definition I offer for it is the aspect of acquired or learned linguistic knowledge, which encompasses factors related to language use, knowledge, distribution, meaning, or occurrence variance. What do we know when we know a language? Well, we know how we use it. We know how we use it. We know how we use it. We possess knowledge of a vast set of rules for how utterances can and do exist in the world. The metalinguistic method of sociolinguistic interview, or MMSI, contains 7 sections, and not unlike a Leibovin interview, progresses the interviewee through stages and tasks which are geared towards eliciting different and increasingly richer types of metacommentary. For this first application, I designed a protocol to elicit commentary on 5 key social factors, as well as other aspects of variance individuals could be expected to comment on. Write 2022, linked here, is a report on the first iteration of this method and contains analysis and discussion from the targeted terms section, 3 thematic reports across sections and interviewees, 3 case studies, and a perceptual experiment. This is perhaps jumping ahead just a bit, but I'm going to share an interview clip with you momentarily. And because we are discussing methods today, I want to give you the smallest idea of how I was coding for aspects of variance and social factors, especially since featural production wasn't of interest for this type of study. More than this, I wanted to highlight that what is being coded here in these lists are the types of things I imagined before a speck of data was collected that folks might be interested in querying my data set for in the future. So while we are certainly discussing outcomes from qualitative data analysis, in my case, this coding was applied as a means of preparing naturalistic linguistic data for more traditional quantitative analyses in the future. I interviewed 17 self-identified Black professionals from Detroit, 7 men and 10 women. 5 interviewees worked in the education sector, 3 in the nonprofit sector, and the other 9 came from different professions. I truly wish we had time for me to tell you about each of them because they are all just spectacular humans, but instead I'll present some findings. This is a reflection that comes from Aries, a 30-year-old male who at the end of his interview asked if he could tell one last story. He recounts here a moment at a conference that he termed a, quote, changing experience for him that made him recognize his Blackness in a different way. This interview was conducted outside, so you will hear some birds chirping.
I went to it and I never forget this lady. I don't remember her name, but she was an author. She wrote a book. And it gave me a different perspective of where, like, how I actually view myself now. She asked this white lady, like, what do you see when you wake up? Like, how do you live your life now? She's like, oh, well, I'm a mother, I'm this and that. I work for a living. I'm an educated woman, striving to success in my department. I think that people see me, because I'm a woman, that I think I'm weak, but I'm very strong woman, stuff like that. That's what she told the white woman told her. She was supposed to tell us me to go back to the same. She's like, you know what I see when I wake up every day? That I'm Black. And she's like, that's something I have to wake up with every single day because even if I don't, I'm reminded that I'm Black by my counterpart. I'm reminded that I'm Black through daily media, through the news, through every different thing. So I can't have a bad day because I'm Black. I can't come to work with emotions on my shoulders because I'm Black. I can lose this. And that was the first time I realized, like, I really do think that I wake up every day and say, like, I'm Black. I have Black moments every single day. And it's a fact. Like, I don't think I've ever had a day where I can just go through life and not think about my color, you know.
Right. Aries is reflecting here on the daily labor involved in living in a Black body, of never being able to forget the history that made our bodies different, of always being on guard. This is reflected in the concept of sociolinguistic labor, which, in attempting to account for the weight of such daily awareness, begins to provide us an understanding of the psychosocial consequences of omnipresent style shifting work. There are people who can just go through life, but Aries isn't one of them. My research questions for the first application of this method involved determining what motivates Black people to style shift. Given Lippy Green's definition of the standard language ideology, the ideology itself may introduce a bias into the system for standard language use that can motivate Black people, and indeed all language users, to move towards the standard. Across the 40 hours of data I collected, I cannot claim that a general bias for the preferred variety of the powerful can account for the daily actions of self-censorship these interviewees reported. Holiday and Squire share reports from their interviewees stating they find racialized varieties to be inappropriate for professional settings. And similarly, Nyland contended shifting towards standardized varieties in Black DC neighborhoods was due to an awareness of stigmatization. While only 2 of my interviewees used the exact words inappropriate or stigma, other interviewees provide meta commentary which suggested these sentiments may be motivators for them as well. However, the motivations of many are murkier in this regard, because a third of interviewees describe making specific attempts to incorporate their racialized varieties into their workplaces. There is also the potential that Black people shift from a desire to stay safe, which Weldon's work on the Black middle class language reports. But Baker Bell tells us is fallacious, as we already discussed, because Black people are never safe. Fallacious or not, 7 of my interviewees reported safeness as a motivator, at times referring to physical safety, maintaining their autonomy, mitigating risk in the workplace or other social spaces, or protecting one's energies by not opening up the opportunity to be misunderstood. Eliciting and analyzing the linguistic production of Black professionals as done in a traditional sociolinguistic interview would not have addressed these several competing narratives in the literature, and I'm grateful to be able to deepen our understanding of Black motivations for style shifting by presenting how these professionals orient to their own experiences. What remains for us to discuss is, are they successful? When Black professionals choose to style shift for whatever reason in the workplace, are they successful in making that movement towards more standardized varieties, in appearing more professional? I designed a speech perception experiment to engage with these shifting practices directly. In each experimental trial, listeners hear a pair of sentences only presented orally and choose which sentence sounds more professional, sentence A or sentence B. In each sentence pair, listeners hear identically worded sentences that differ in the number of non-standard variables present. These 3 variables were chosen because interviewees cited them as aspects of the racialized styles they shift away from in the practice of their professions. And in the case of Day, interviewees also cited this feature as indicative of Detroit speech, or sounding very city. There were 3 between subjects conditions tested in a fully randomized design, followed by a diagnostic pair, which was presented last to all of 300 total listeners. In the interest of time, I'm going to present results which best demonstrate the ways in which these variables relate to each other. Here, the diagnostic case is testing an all-standard sentence against a sentence with 1 non-standard feature present, acts. Let's hear those sentences. Here is your all-standard sentence.
We knew they might ask about a new trend in stock options.
And here's your 1 variable featuring metathesis.
We knew they might ask about a new trend in stock options.
The outcomes for this condition established that the overwhelming majority of listeners across demographic categories reliably choose the all-standard sentence as more professional sounding. That blue bar, demonstrably larger than the red bar. Sets 1 and 2 exist. They're in the bonus features. Don't scroll there now. You can't. I didn't share my slides. Set 3 is designed to be more closely assess the relative professionalism of the 3 variables under study. So we have a sentence with one variable being compared to a double variable sentence. And I'm going to just quickly play a sample of that double variable sentence featuring TH stopping and consonant cluster reduction.
We knew they might ask about a new trend in stock options.
And the outcome of this condition finds that while the general trend is still present, all of those blue bars are larger, not all of these variables behave the same. In fact, the salience of acts is so strong that it begins to produce a blocking effect, and that listeners are as likely to choose that two variable sentence as professional sounding as they are to choose the one variable sentence. A true blocking effect would make the red bar larger, but this toss-up outcome suggests that listeners' stereotypes about acts were activated. Listeners are weighting a single act against the other two variables in terms of professionalism, and the results indicate the 100 participants who received this sentence pair were split in their judgments. When viewed in relation to the diagnostic case, where all 300 participants made a decision between ask and acts in terms of professionalism, their choice was strikingly not in favor of the highly salient, Black index, non-standard, and deeply stereotyped speech feature. Comparing the outcomes of these two conditions indicates that stereotype activation may indeed hinder certain types of processing across demographic categories, a possibility those cited here have also raised, although direct experimentation will be needed to confirm that. These results indicate that Black professionals are less successful in conveying professionalism when features of non-standard racialized varieties are present. It would seem then that Black professionals do indeed need to engage in style shifting practices, in sociolinguistic labor, which moves their linguistic production towards more standardized varieties to be perceived as more professional sounding. That if they choose to sound like themselves at work, their identities as professionals are more likely to be rejected by audiences. With these findings in mind, I'd like to offer some final connected themes for where this research is headed generally, and I'll preface this by underscoring that my intellectual curiosity is seated in the voice and how it functions in the mind and the world, and I find no fault in others who also seat themselves within the core. That said, the design of the MMSI addresses one of the more stark issues of inequity in linguistic theoretical development, and that is phonocentrism. The study of speech has been prioritized over the past 50 years in linguistic inquiry at the expense of all other forms of communication, not only over other forms of linguistic structure. Many linguists and language-related experts from other fields, such as speech pathologists, maintain the belief that speech is the only viable and acceptable form of languaging. And this has palpable consequences, not only in our theory, but in the wider world for language users. This matters for considering the ways in which language users could and should have their language use collected, and the parts of their linguistic production worth analyzing once they've shared their experiences with their whole bodies in front of whatever recording equipment they've consented to. In this light, what I would like to see happening in the future of linguistics, no matter what type of linguistic material is being considered in these studies, is a centering of community members in the production and or reporting of the work. Many researchers take such efforts with Indigenous people, but in fact, we should be taking such efforts with all people, and in my opinion, work on linguistic variation that is not meaningfully engaging with or reporting the perspectives of the communities it is researching should never be accepted for publication moving forward. Now, it isn't feasible for every study to be embedded in a community. But every study in our field is analyzing language, and you can't make language without a body. What that necessitates then is a concerted and purposeful recognition of the bodies and beings that provide us with our data, regardless of our research questions. Right? 2022 also introduces a model for representative and inclusive demographic surveys, which can aid us in capturing more information about our participant population. And it is my hope that every single study for the rest of time will report full demographics of its participants so that we may always learn as much as possible about the phenomena we research, and that the fullest extent of the scientific method may be realized as our theory develops through generations of replication. It is really all just about prioritizing language users. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, in that case, thank you very much, Kelly. Kelly, I don't know if you'd like to just call on people, if you'd like to open this up, I'll let you run this however you'd like.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to get these slides shared for you, so I will definitely have them dropped in the chat before it's over. Please. Well, I'm going to work on sharing those slides. Somebody can ask. Will.
Well, I do have a question for you. In the world of, God, I hate bringing this up again, ChatGPT, ever heard about that? Any of you? But in this world where we are increasingly seeing these large models used and useful, you sort of mentioned the bias inherent to these LLMs, but do you see a future, or do you see a way in which these can be done more responsibly outside of just biasing the training data, in which these can work towards a more just world rather than just, well, being what they are right now?
I do. I think that that's a good question. So in the whole like video killed the radio star idea of this, right? We see these jumps in technology and everyone's like, the world's ending, society has devolved to the point of no, progress. And then people are like, did you know that video is really interesting for, showing us X, Y, and Z, right? It's like that. So there are certainly applications where these kinds of models can be applied in service of justice. Are they being applied that way? I'm not sure. And if that imbalance is carried on into new iterations of these models, which is exactly what we're seeing now. Like GPT-3, was trained on, it's just carrying those impressions of incomplete data sets along with it in its learning trajectory. And so I really do think that justice can be applied by just putting more data into the model in some ways, but these models aren't so flawed that they are inherently useless, right? We're certainly seeing people apply them in interesting ways and demonstrating these spaces that exist between machines and humans for the ways that we learn, and that's very useful.
Thank you. Any other questions? Feel free to raise your Zoom hand. Not everybody all at once.
I'm so close to having these slides shared.
Looks like we've got a question. Mark, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I don't want to interrupt you sharing the slides,
please,
but I had
please.
a question. I had a question if you could show the slide that has like the list of words that are found to be significantly racialized
Sure.
on the data set.
Absolutely. Okay, shall, here are these, and I will share again. And you wanted to see the corpus results?
Correct.
Got it. Do you have a question?
I was just really almost kind of a silly question, but I saw that the word who there's
wrong
one
slide.
slide that had like a list of words with there's I think it was like this slide before, this one.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea why the word whom is significantly racialized?
Yeah, okay. No. I have an idea of why it's still in this data set, but I don't know why whom is significantly racialized, and why it's imbalanced towards the Black subcorpus. This has been an interesting question I've got before. So when the way that I analyze athletic or these other terms, We didn't talk about this today, but one of the terms that's particularly interesting is culture. And how I determine that there are new senses of that lexeme emerging is by looking at all of those uses in context. And there's nothing special about the way whom is being used in context here. I think it's epiphenomenal.
Okay.
But if you were smarter than me, you would have removed words like this before you ran your analysis, which I did not. Baby programmer.
Yeah. I did also just want to ask, like, I got here a bit late because I TA class right before this, but do you have like I'm assuming there's an earlier slide that says more about like just how many like tokens and date and just like the size of this corpus in journal, because I came in like pretty much right on this slide and I was missing a bit of context.
Yeah, absolutely. And now that you have a link to them, you can definitely check it out. There's a full transcript, so you can see how it was characterizing me. Oh, I passed it. Yeah. So 8.5 million lexical tokens, 15,000-ish words being looked at. So it's not the biggest corpus, but large enough to say something.
Of course.
Are there more questions? Or do you have, did I answer your question?
Yeah, you
Okay,
answered my
good.
question. Thank
Okay,
you.
good. I know, I threw so much at you. There's a lot there. Oh, thanks, Drew.
I do have a question.
Okay, yeah.
Hey. So something I'm thinking, I am often thinking about is I did a recent, relatively similar kind of type of machine learning analysis on podcasts looking at gender identity, sexual orientation, and gender expression. And so a lot of people, and it was a perception experiment. So I was assessing people's perception of certain things within these podcasts.
That's cool.
Within the speakers of the podcasts. And a lot of people consistently ask me about the identity of the speakers, right? So in the discussion of what the perception is and what the listeners are doing, everybody always really, really wants to know who the speakers are, who are the speakers, right? And the issue with collecting podcast info and sort of trying to collect and build a corpus in a way that's not super, what do I want to say? In a way that you're not building it or having people come and record the sentences or doing anything like that. There's these like ethical considerations about like how much is the public information that a person has given one of these speakers actually like something I can use as an experimental variable, right? So say that I have like speakers that are part of these stimuli that are Black, and then there's speakers that are part of the stimuli that are white, but only half of them have, you know, maybe on their Twitter bio or somewhere else have actually identified themselves as Black. There's just a question about, I guess, generally about like the best practice to try and sort of describe this information without making too much of an assumption as the researcher.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Just gonna put did they ask you the identities of the listeners? Okay, sorry. This is such a thing. Okay, so it's incredibly challenging for a lot of the reasons why you mentioned. I think the short answer for this is describing. Like you were saying, how do I describe? And it is that of like my corpus, when I talk about it, I'm like, it's balanced for race and gender, but it ain't balanced for anything else. Right. It's 108-year time death. Like, you know, Jack Johnson, before the internet existed, did not have as many words printed about him as Serena Williams. And I will never, ever, ever be able to build out that imbalance. It's not reasonable. Right. And so that's certainly in the description of the tool, right? Of like, here's what this can speak to, and here's what it very much can't. And so in that same tradition, I think talking about, you know, the identities of your participants in that same way of like, for me, there are people who are not in my corpus who had many, many things printed about them because I couldn't verify their identities in this way, because self-reported race and gender were so important to the analysis that I was making that nobody could be in my corpus unless they had done exactly what you said, of talked in an interview or put on their Twitter bio or exactly who they are. And that actually somehow introduces another variable, right? Like it's like you said, you can very easily like get stuck in there. But I think that there is just a point where you're just describing the choices you made and you move forward, because not everything is ever going to be controlled. For my participants in the dissertation, where I was interviewing them and talking to them directly, I just went with what they said. And in the demographic survey, which asks people like who they are, it's a 2-stage question. So people have like, tell me exactly how you identify, you know, a list and then free response and whatever. But then the next question is like, and how would you like to be grouped for the study? You know, in lots of different places, because most people do that for like gender, but it's like in lots of different places for politics and everything is sort of like, tell me who you are and then tell me where you want me to put you. So yeah, all of that is to say the method that you are using is, I think, the most equitable, right? Of seeing what you can see and then just describing what you have, not making too much of a big deal about it.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you for doing that study.
It'll be out soon. It'll be out soon.
Anything else? Anybody else?
I see that note about permissions. I'll change it. It shouldn't be there.
Who are you to grant permission for us to understand language? Sorry. Okay. Please, somebody ask a question so we don't end on that pun. And there's no saving this. Okay, in that case, thank you very, very much, Kelly, for coming to chat with us here at CSS. We appreciate you. Thank you, everybody, for coming to the presentation. And Kelly is, oh, thank you, Ben, fixed. Kelly can be contacted by the information in her slides, and feel free to get those slides if you need that link. This is a good time. Or I can also arrange to have it sent around in the Slack channel as well. If one of you could do that, that would actually be wonderful. And at Sociolinguistic on Twitter. Yep, you are on Twitter quite regularly. Kelly is a denizen of academic Twitter. I
can be pulled into Twitter, you know, with
okay, fair enough,
notification.
Yeah, got it. But all right. Thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here.
Bye,
please
everybody.
reach out. Please, please,
Yes.
please. Yay. Please thank Drew for me.
Yes, I absolutely will.
Okay.
Hold on. Let me stop the recording here. Do I have that ability? Yes.